To understand nitrogen deposition, you first have to understand the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is described as the movement of nitrogen from living things to non-living things. Non-living things include the world around us, and living things include animals and plants. The nitrogen cycle can influence biological systems. For instance, in the atmosphere, it can affect it regionally and globally. It contributes to greenhouse warming. And this, I get into more detail in the effects on the atmosphere slide. And then it affects the terrestrial systems by imbalancing the nutrients in the trees. And it can also cause a loss of diversity, which in turn affects many things. And then it also affects the aquatic systems. If there's more nitrate concentrations, that means that it can affect the animals living in the water. It can also affect humans if they drink the water. It also affects the lakes in making them more acidic, and it also loses diversity in the ocean if this is not fixed.
Human alteration of the nitrogen cycle. The most fundamental human-caused change to the global nitrogen cycle is a doubling of the transfer from the vast and unreactive atmospheric pool to biologically available forms on land, which is made by nitrogen fixation. Many recent reviews showed that human activity has majorly increased rates of nitrogen fixation. As our population continues to grow rapidly and urbanization increases, the high rates of industrial nitrogen fixation will continue for decades. Sources of this change include: first is the use of nitrogen fertilizer excluding manure and other organic forms. Second is fossil fuel combustion. Fixed nitrogen is transferred from old reservoirs to the atmosphere by the burning of fossil fuels, and also small amounts of atmospheric N2 are fixed by the high temperature combustion. Third is by the use of nitrogen fixing crops like legumes and forages. Overall, 140 teragrams of nitrogen is fixed by human activity per year in terrestrial ecosystems, increasing both the availability and the mobility of nitrogen over large regions of Earth.
Nitrogen deposition affects the atmosphere in many ways, and usually they are not positive effects. First, nitrogen deposition contributes to greenhouse gases, and most of the nitrogen in the atmosphere, most compounds that are emitted to the atmosphere, are not good compounds and usually are detrimental to the ozone layer. And when there's more nitrogen in the atmosphere, this increases the nitrogen that is in land and in the ocean. So when nitrogen is released through cities, factories, or farms, it gets into the atmosphere, and then it can come down either through acid rain, which affects the acidification or the acid levels in lakes and streams, which can affect the animals and plants that get water from those lakes and streams, and it also affects the plants that are taking in that water, and it can lead to plants dying out and losing certain species of plants.
Nitrogen deposition and changes in ecosystem composition and biodiversity. What is nitrogen deposition? It is the input of reactive nitrogen from the atmosphere to the biosphere, both as dry deposition and wet deposition. Wet deposition is mainly rain and snow that carry nitrate and ammonium. Dry deposition involves complex interactions between nitrogen compounds in the air and plant, water, soil, rock, or building surfaces. Nitrogen deposition greatly affects biodiversity both in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Excess available nitrogen contributes to major environmental problems such as reduced drinking water quality, eutrophication of estuaries, disruptions in nutrient cycling, and acidification of the soil.
Hi, my name is Trendon Byrne, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about nitrogen saturation and the ecosystem function, as well as the effects of this on aquatic ecosystems. So nitrogen saturation is basically when there are certain limitations of nitrogen in an ecosystem, and as a result that nitrogen is made up and is provided to relieve the ecosystem of the shortages that it was experiencing. And a key component of a nitrogen saturated ecosystem is that it doesn't have amounts of carbon stored for reasons that are unknown. So a good example would be in an ecosystem where carbon dioxide levels are gradually increasing. And whenever an ecosystem experiences nitrogen saturation, factors of the environment such as the atmosphere, groundwater, and streams all result in nitrogen deposition, as well as the eradication of any amounts of carbon that were stored. The factors that are key in the removal of nitrogen, as well as the specific limitations on the ecosystem, are crucial in the ability of the ecosystem to experience the direct effects of nitrogen and the effects it has on its environment. And the main importance of nitrogen saturation is that it's directly proportional to how the land is used, how the climate interacts with the environment, and how the factors of the environment that cause the drastic changes, such as carbon dioxide and ozone, and how these affect the ecosystem. So a major effect on the aquatic ecosystem are when humans alter the nitrogen cycle. And whenever humans do this, it means that nitrate ions are lost, which means that movement of anions through the soil and into the streams and other groundwater brings in cations, which eliminate the calcium and nutrients in the soil that are needed for life. And a big part of this is the increase of nitrogen emissions and nitrogen saturated ecosystems, and the difficulty that comes with this in sustaining sulfuric acid and making sure that it is reduced as much as possible. And whenever the difficulty of this arises, that means that there's going to be basically no ability to decrease the chances of our bodies of water getting affected by acid rain. So it is pretty obvious from that standpoint that the best route to managing acidification is reducing both nitrogen emissions and deposition. This can be done by creating a threshold for the amount of nitrogen and ensuring excess nitrogen doesn't leak into areas containing water. And another part of this is how eutrophication affects eutrophies and the drastic effects it has on our ecosystem. So basically, eutrophication results in little to no oxygen in an ecosystem, which is basically estuaries. And this is a problem because little or no amounts of oxygen really affects our bodies of water because it starts to kill off fish, shellfish. And then another big part of this that I found in research was it affects macroalgae, which is huge in creating reef homes, as well as a food source for many herbivores that live in the water. So the direct effects of the eutrophication in eutrophies provides a huge effect on aquatic ecosystems and prevents them from sustaining the amount of life that we.
Major uncertainties. Background on nitrogen deposition and loss. Nitrogen deposition is the input nitrogen in the areas it is unneeded and the resulting consequences. Nitrogen loss is the impact humans have made to environments that result in the nitrogen levels being depleted. It is currently shown that the rates of nitrogen deposition and loss are improving steadily. Marine nitrogen fixation. Many factors are unknown due to the inability to fully comprehend the unmodified nitrogen cycle in the open ocean. The knowledge we currently have is insufficient for us to draw conclusions besides that humans have actively changed the nitrogen cycle potentially enough to alter certain biological processes. Changing resource limitation. Due to human involvement, certain ecosystems whose biological processes were limited now have a larger quantity of nitrogen, and the ramifications of this are still unknown. Nitrogen retention capacity. We do not yet have a complete understanding of why and how there is so much variation in the processes of systems by which they retain nitrogen or how they have and will change over time. Alteration of denitrification. Our understanding of denitrification is inadequate, although we do see that areas such as riparian and wetlands make more significant contributions. Mankind's activities have impacted the quantity and distribution of denitrification. Future prospects. Future implications of nitrogen cycling. The end cycle is very closely tied to mankind's choices. As our population grows and we continue to urbanize the planet, destroy wetlands, and abuse fossil fuels, we can only hope our efforts to reverse the damage done are effective.